G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. We'll have The Outsiders and then First Dog on the Moon, I think.
Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy and you're not. But he loves us really. In the Outsiders ring this morning, editor of King's Tribune, Jane Gilmore, Nick Fike, he's from The Monthly, and from the Institute of Public Affairs, James Patterson. Welcome to you all. Interesting time politically, I reckon. Both parties, and Bill Shorten was doing this quite overtly in the last week, looking for ideas and new policy directions, but both parties scratching a little bit for their path. Is the government finding its way, James?
It is, and quicker and in a better way than I expected it to. During the election and during the period of opposition, they took quite a populist, small target path, and there wasn't a really strong indication of where they would go at government and how they would deal with the unexpected crises that do arise.
An anxiety that that's the way they would perform more than...
Absolutely. There was a broad concern on the right, particularly those who are firm believers in the free market, as we are at the IPA and our friends elsewhere. But in government, I have to say, I've been pleasantly surprised. I think the decisions on Qantas and SPC are extremely impressive, and decisions that wouldn't necessarily have been made by John Howard's government. And the language used to justify these decisions has been explicitly free market. Qantas has to look after its own shop. We can't bail out SPC. It's up to them to make themselves competitive. That's really encouraging for people on the right to see this philosophy being put around the decisions.
Brushing GrainCorp to one side.
Yes. So it hasn't been a blemish-free record. GrainCorp wasn't great, and as everyone has said, the Cadbury decision is inexcusable. But there are some signs of optimism for people who want to see a stronger philosophical bent in government, because they're using real free market ideas and rhetoric to justify these decisions to not bail out SPC and not bail out Qantas, even though probably a big part of the decision is the budget situation and just a practical issue that the money is just not there.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it, Jane? I mean, we know that there's a tough budget situation. We know that the government is going to respond to it toughly, or they tell us that this is the case. Well, they've got 900 pages of toughness sitting in the PM's office at the moment.
I disagree with James. I don't think they are actually doing a good job. And there is a quote, this is from one of our leading politicians, 2010, "Too much political thinking is about winning or holding government rather than what might be done once you're there. If our current Prime Minister had spent more time thinking about how to govern before winning the next election, he might have turned out to be as an effective a Prime Minister as he was an opposition leader." That was Tony Abbott talking about Kevin Rudd. Now, I think it's a beautiful quote, because it's exactly his problem. They didn't have a plan B. They came in with this agenda of things that they wanted to do, knowing that they wouldn't be able to get it through the Senate, but didn't have what are we going to do in the meantime? So there's all these, the carbon tax, the paid parental leave scheme, all the things that they're insisting they were going to do, but they can't do it. So now they're kind of just fruitling about, squabbling with each other.
Well, that's the other thing, Nick, that Abbott said about Rudd, rather, that he hit the ground reviewing. This is precisely what the current government have done.
Yeah.
Where do you...
commissioning.
Well, yes, indeed. And there's been a lot of information has been acquired, and as Jane says, there's impediments with the Senate. But there's also that sort of sense of hiatus before we have the revelations from the Audit Commission, before we have the budget. Do you think in that position we're finding a path, or are they lost?
I don't think they're lost at all. I think they've, like James said, they finally seem to have found, especially with the Qantas decision, they've found their sort of economic ideology, and they've finally stuck to it after some early, steps in different directions, in all sorts of directions. They finally, and I don't think people expected that it would be Tony Abbott would be the one who really sort of drew that line in the sand and said, on Qantas, will say no, despite the fact that it's not particularly a popular thing. I mean, the polling that came out about Qantas said that what they've decided to do to try to change the Sale Act is the least popular of decisions that a government could make in regard to Qantas. So I do think that they've found a sort of their philosophical position. It just means, unfortunately, it seems to be a position of just saying no and doing nothing until they get the carbon tax through, because all of their decisions, like even if you look back to GrainCorp, but regarding SPC, regarding Holden, in every case, the response has been, no, you do it. which I guess, is absolutely a legitimate, neoliberal position to take, but I think it'll be interesting to see whether the general public agree.
Is there a need there, James, for a plan B around the carbon tax? That's prominent, but the Qantas Sale Act hitting the same obstacle of the Senate. Is it enough to just say, we can't do this, when knowing that you couldn't do that was something that you have been fully aware of going into that situation? Why are you not more adaptable?
In a political sense, I'm sure they're quite happy that there's nothing that can be done about the carbon tax, because it continues to be a great issue to beat the Labor Party over the head with. I mean, if Labor really wants to win back some of the seats they lost in, outer suburban Sydney and Brisbane and Melbourne and elsewhere in the country, it's going to be really tough for them to be arguing for higher energy prices for those very price-conscious consumers. And so it's a great political tool for the coalition to say, well, we would love to be lowering your electricity prices. We would love to get rid of this carbon tax, which is not making any difference to the environment. But unfortunately, those buggers in the Labor Party, they won't let us do it. That's a great story for Tony Abbott to continue to tell. Once the new Senate does come around, I think it will go. I think the numbers will be there.
But doesn't that, Jane, fly in the face of this argument that the government is sort of finding its ideological way? I mean, that to me suggests that they're going to be wanting to do a bit more than just play politics around the resistance to the carbon tax.
Well, I think in some ways I agree with James that they're going to be in more trouble if they could repeal it than if they can't, because once they do, electricity prices actually won't go down, they'll still go up, and trying to explain to the electorate, oh yes, but they just didn't go up by quite as much, it just won't work. So that's going to make them look silly. They lose this huge stick to beat the opposition with, and don't really have much to replace it with.
I mean, that is going to be an extraordinarily awkward moment. The carbon tax has been built up into this thing of almost pure politics. It's
and when you actually look at it, it's minuscule, and it's all about the network costs, which are invisible taxes for the state governments. So there's a whole lot of other work that could be done that could reduce electricity prices much more significantly than removing the carbon tax.
Not to mention that at that moment when the carbon tax does get repealed, all of a sudden the government is holding a direct action program which runs entirely against their new sort of economic philosophy. It's absolutely about warping the so-called marketplace for carbon emissions. It's direct government spending on something that all economists and all reasonable people would say should be done via a market mechanism if you're choosing to reduce emissions. I mean, the fact is that the government doesn't seem to have thought through the fact that emissions need to be reduced in future.
And there's going to be, I mean, the Senate is a very, very interesting thing in the next 6 months of our politics. There are really no guarantees about its behaviour, around a lot of the cuts that we're presumably going to see from the budget, no guarantees of its behaviour around Qantas, perhaps a better sort of sense of how it might behave around the carbon tax. But this looms as a really, really tough thing for the government to confront.
Can I just jump in quickly there on direct action? I agree with Nick. It's an extremely silly, wasteful way of spending money, and it's not something that the government should pursue. But I think it's not accurate to compare, the carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme on the one hand and direct action on the other hand as if they're polar opposites and not at all connected. The carbon tax scheme that the Julie Gillard government passed is loaded to the gills with direct action measures. I mean, one of the centerpieces of it is a Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is a government-backed bank which invests in, it picks winners and chooses renewable energy schemes to invest in. There's loads of little schemes in... but it's a direct action measure by definition. There's lots of regulatory aspects of it. There are free permits that have been handing out. I mean, there is not some perfect market mechanism. It is government doing what government does, picking winners, choosing favourites and penalising others.
In an ideal world, we might have...
Yes, but it was part of a transition policy. It wasn't there as the only policy, which is what direct action is, which is why it's a problem.
No, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation is supposed to exist forever. It's not a transition policy.
It's part of the transition from the flat rate into the emissions trading scheme, so that it's not a thing that exists on its own as the only measure to reduce emissions, which is what direct action is, and which is why it is a problem in so many ways, or one of the reasons it's a problem.
Bill Shorten, speaking of problems, he made a rather interesting speech at which he put out a plea, and let's not all keep seeing the same hands. He said he wants ideas, he wants policy. The policies that Labor took to the last election will not win them the next one. he said. How desperate is his plight, Nick? Or is that a good sign that he's recognising the problem?
It's always taken as a good sign when Labor Party people come up with a new plan to reinvigorate the party. It's been happening since John Button, put out I think it was like the first or second quarterly essay saying it's time that the Labor Party really...
Looks like he might get a document that he can completely ignore.
Yeah, well, these documents keep coming out, these ideas keep coming out about, broadening the base of the party. The problem is not that it's difficult to join the Labor Party. The problem at the moment is that people don't understand what the Labor Party stands for. They need to find... I mean, maybe this would be great if they can find a way of engaging better with the broader community and finding their purpose. I mean, that's what political parties are supposed to do. The problem is that every time someone then raises a concrete measure to reduce the influence of unions in the party, it gets knocked back. So it's all very well to talk about it, but I'll wait and see.
This is chicken and egg, isn't it, Jane? I mean, the Labor Party might have a chance of being reinvested with ideas if it could be reinvested in membership, but...
Yeah, the biggest problem that everybody has with the Labor Party, which is the fractional interference with what the Labor Party is actually meant to be doing, is going to be the one thing that's also going to stop them being able to fix that. So they just get into this circular loop. And I think it's a terrible thing because whether you agree with the Abbott government or not, you need to have a genuine opposition, a real alternative government. And at the moment, the Labor Party just isn't that. They're not an effective opposition, particularly in things like the asylum seekers where they just won't say anything because they know.
They had a very effective opposition last time round that wasn't policy and program based. It was simply based around objection.
Well, yes, and that's exactly my point, is I think what most people really want, again, whether they agree with Abbott or not, is a viable alternative. And until Labor can sort out their factional infighting, they're never ever going to be that.
Which takes us inevitably, I think, to the notion of unions in industrial relations. This is Outsiders. We're speaking with Jane Gilmore, Nick Fyke and James Patterson. And James, I'm suspecting that you and yours will have been pleased to see the leaked terms of reference to the Productivity Commission inquiry into the Fair Work Act.
Yes and no. I mean, it's welcome that the Productivity Commission has been given a wide remit to conduct their inquiry, but all inquiries should do that. All inquiries should have that. You don't get much
points
it was
for
letting
wide.
a bunch of economists look at the problem as it is and not narrowing their role artificially. The real issue is not what the Productivity Commission is allowed to research, because undoubtedly they will come out and say Australia's industrialisation system is holding us back economically and it does need reform. The key issue is what the government will do with it, how the government will respond to it. They used very precise and very stringent language in opposition about being very cautious on industrial relations and doing very little on industrial relations. So they're really going to be quite hamstrung by that. You can't run a campaign for 6 years in opposition on election promises and adhering to them absolutely, and then depart much from your own. So
it's the risk for this term, surely, for Tony Abbott, that hampered by that rhetoric, this will be a term of setting up a second-term agenda.
They went far too far, in my view, in the last couple of years in opposition, ruling things out and being too stringent. I think it made very little difference to the election. I think they still would have won the election even if they had left the door open a bit more to do some more reform, and they would have found themselves in government with a lot more flexibility to respond to the issues that have arisen. And unfortunately, I think this is going to have to be a second-term issue, and that presumes that there will be a second term, and that the second term will have a good majority and a workable Senate, which is all not guaranteed.
And Jane, just quickly, a Productivity Commission inquiry into female representation in Parliament?
The problem with quotas is everybody assumes that then what's going to happen is you will have more qualified men pushed aside for a less qualified woman just to fill the quota. And it's actually bollocks, because what it assumes is that at the moment, more qualified women are not being pushed aside for less qualified men. Now, obviously in the Liberal Party, where they've got 30% female MPs and one woman in the cabinet, there is not an equal playing level of opportunity, a playing field of opportunity, unless you assume that this is because the men in the Liberal Party are simply better, which I think everybody can probably disagree with. So, yes, I think in this case it's justified.
Jane Gilmore there. She's been one of our outsiders this morning, editor of King's Tribune. The others on the panel have been Nick Fyke from the Monthly and from the Institute of Public Affairs, James Patterson. More of that next week. It's 6.5 away from 10.
Hello, Patriots. Welcome to First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. I'm Walkley Award-winning cartoonist First Dog on the Moon. And this week's edition of The Guide takes place at Camp Woodchip, somewhere in the Tamar Valley. You wanted to see me, sir?
Ah, young Frappington. Come in. Take a seat, lad.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Frappington, how long have you been with us?
Oh, I think it's about 6 weeks since I enlisted, sir. Although technically I was voluntarily conscripted. But you go on, sir.
6 weeks. Now, how are you finding the Green Army, Frappington?
Oh, it's marvellous, sir. Absolutely top shelf.
I see. Well, that is good. Now, it's come to my attention that since you joined us, Frappington, there have been a number of, well, let's say incidents with a military character.
I don't know what you mean, sir.
You do understand, Frappington, that the Green Army is not an actual army.
Oh, of course, sir.
It's simply a federal government program to assist young people and the long-term unemployed and other fiddly, hard-to-fix groups like Indigenous kiddies and folks with disabilities and so on to engage in meaningful work activities, to get them off the government teat, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely, sir. When my case manager Brian suggested to me as an opportunity to get off the dole and out in the fresh air while helping tidy the environment, I was awfully keen. Well, it's not an actual job, and I only get half the minimum wage, and I didn't have any choice. I do understand it's not the army either, so I know we won't be invading Poland or anything, not right away.
Indeed, and that is my point, Frappington. Can you see any reason why anyone engaged in any of these activities, whether it be clearing litter from highways or painting a fence at an aged care facility, why anyone doing any of those jobs would require a weapon of any kind?
I don't know what you mean, sir.
More specifically, a flamethrower. Frappington, is there any reason why anyone would need a flamethrower to help with painting an old people's home?
I can't think of one, sir.
I see. And how about an armoured personnel carrier with a 30mm cannon?
I'm not sure what you're getting at, sir.
Frappington, it's come to our attention that not only did you attend last Thursday's Green Army help an older person working bee with a fierce array of weaponry, including ninja stars and a small catapult, you also used a kilo of plastic explosive to blast a 10-foot crater in the middle of the Lang Hancock Memorial Herbarium.
Yes, sir, I did, sir. It's the weeds, sir.
The weeds?
Yes, sir, the noxious weeds.
Frappington, weren't you given a pitchfork and a pair of gloves and one of those ridiculous garden-strength garbage bags that tears the moment you put a twig in it? Couldn't you have used those like everyone else?
You don't understand, sir. The greatest threat to our environment since the old-growth forests were left to just go feral are the introduced species of noxious weeds. I'm just following orders, sir. Even the Prime Minister's behind me. He wants to unlock all the national parks and let the timber workers introduce some proper conservation. And the weeds, sir. We need to deal with the weeds. The world is full of them, sir. The weeds. The weeds, like the Spanish oyster plant, or golden thistle as it's more commonly known, and the Bengal clock vine and the Mexican bean tree. What about New Zealand pampas grass, sir, or the interestingly named apple of Sodom, also known as the Afghan thistle, or Solanum lineum. Then there's the cayenne snakeweed and the dread cumbungus, or bulrush, sir, the Italian cocklebur, the Indian jujube, and the Christ thorn, Ziziphus spina Christi, and my personal favourite, sir, the Venezuelan fighting shrub. More pricks in that one than in question time, sir.
You waved that last one up, didn't you, Frappington?
Yes, I did, sir, but the others, they're all out there, and someone has to do something about it. By gosh, sir, it's going to be me.
Put the gun down, Frappington. I'm concerned about the flamethrower and the armoured personnel carrier, but I'm glad to see that from joining the Green Army you've learnt an enormous amount about noxious weeds. That certainly is something.
Oh no, sir. No, I've been a noxious weed enthusiast my whole life, ever since I was a little tacker on my grand's knee when she poured kerosene on the dandelions. She was unfortunately killed when she got a bindi under her thumb. The poor woman never recovered, and since that day, I've dedicated my life to the eradication of introduced pests.
Go on, Frappington.
Yes, sir. I'm calling it Operation Floral Borders.
Yes, he said that. Dear me.
Well, First Dog's back on form, so it appears. But it was certainly interesting to hear that even the right-wing free market economic philosopher from the fascist think tank on the Outsiders admitted that Tony Abbott's government has hit the ground reviewing, and it's not been able to implement any of the marvellous magic fix-it-all three-word slogan policies that it said it was going to do, and it's ruled out everything else that it would like to do in order to get itself elected, and therefore Tony's sort of looking a bit dead in the water. And meanwhile, Scott Ludlam has gone viral with a wonderful speech welcoming Tony Abbott to West Australia on the grounds that every time Tony Abbott sticks his head over the border, the Green vote goes up. So maybe, possibly, perhaps, the West Australian half-Senate rerun of the election, which was rendered dodgy because nearly 1,400 votes went missing between the first count, in which Scott Ludlam got re-elected, and the second count, in which he didn't get elected. And maybe the people in Western Australia will come to their senses and recognise that it's a bad idea to have the Liberal National Government in a position to pass anything utterly disastrous through the Senate. And maybe we'll get a few more Green senators. But in the long-term view, gee, I wish this Scott Ludlam fellow was in the House of Representatives, because he'd make a corker of a Prime Minister. His speech went viral. I mean, 500,000 views on a speech by an Australian politician at 10 o'clock at night to an empty Senate chamber. 7.5-minute speech. Normally the Greens, when they release movies, they're lucky to get 50 views. I've been subscribed to them for years. So that's the week in politics in Australia. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.